The warning came while Lady Beatrice Vane was standing in her cousin's dressing room with a needle between her fingers and one pearl trembling loose from the only gown she owned that could still pass for elegance. "Do not wear that sash to Halewick Park," the maid whispered from the doorway. "Not if you value your peace." Beatrice looked up from the ivory silk spread across her lap. The gown had once belonged to her mother, though time had thinned it at the seams and left the bodice a little too severe for the present fashion. She had spent the morning coaxing dignity from tired fabric, setting small imitation pearls along a narrow sash to draw the eye away from where the skirt had been turned and mended. In a house filled with trunks of new dresses, French ribbons, and excited talk of the Duke of Wycliffe, her own careful work looked almost defiant. She should have smiled at the maid and asked what such a strange warning meant. Instead, she set down the needle and listened. London pressed against the windows of Avonmere House in pale spring light, all carriage wheels, calling bells, and the restless murmur of a season that never forgave a woman for having too little money. Beatrice had been born Lady Beatrice Vane, daughter of the late Earl of Avonmere. The title remained attached to her name like a ribbon saved from a ruined gift. The estate, the income, and the power had passed to her uncle, the current Earl, and with them had passed every easy assumption of belonging. She was still received in drawing rooms. She was still placed at dinner. She was still addressed with courtesy by people who knew precisely how to make courtesy feel like charity. The maid, a slight young woman named Nell, stepped farther inside and lowered her voice. Lady Cecily's maid asked how it fastened. "The sash, I mean." She asked whether it tied or clasped, and whether the back seam was strong. Beatrice looked at the ivory gown again. A dozen tiny pearls caught the light as if they did not know they were false. Perhaps she is only curious. Nell's mouth tightened. "No, my lady. Not curious. Careful." Before Beatrice could answer, laughter floated from the adjoining chamber, bright and polished as cut glass. Lady Cecily Vane entered without knocking, a vision of rose silk and creamy shoulders, with two maids behind her carrying gloves, slippers, and a travelling cloak edged in swansdown. Cecily was the daughter of the current Earl of Avonmere and the undisputed jewel of the family. She had been praised since childhood for the sort of beauty that required witnesses. Her golden hair had been dressed for travel as though the road to Hampshire were a private procession in her honour. Her eyes moved at once to Beatrice's gown. "Oh, Beatrice," she said softly. "How industrious you look." Nell dropped a curtsy and slipped out, but not before Beatrice saw the warning in her face. Beatrice folded the sash over her palm, concealing the weakest seam. "I dislike arriving anywhere unfinished." Cecily crossed the room and touched one of the pearls with a gloved finger. "It is almost suitable." She smiled as if she had bestowed kindness. "No one could accuse you of vanity, at least. That is a comfort. Men distrust vanity in women without fortunes. Then I am fortunate to be so safe from suspicion." Cecily's smile thinned. She preferred Beatrice grateful, not steady. "You must not be sharp at Halewick. Lady Maud says the Duke of Wycliffe notices everything. Then perhaps sharpness will save him trouble." "Beatrice." The voice from the doorway belonged to Lady Maud Carrow, who had arrived in a plume-trimmed bonnet and an expression of permanent correction. She was not a relation, but she had governed Cecily's social ascent with the devotion of a general arranging artillery. She had secured invitations, discouraged unsuitable friendships, praised the right widows, and smiled at the right dowagers. In her mind, Halewick Park was not a visit. It was a campaign. A young lady without fortune should never mistake wit for position. Beatrice rose because Lady Maud expected her to remain seated. The movement was small, but it changed the air. "I would never mistake one for the other." Lady Maud examined her with the merciless calm of a woman pricing damaged lace. "Good. The gathering at Halewick Park is not an ordinary country visit. The Dowager Duchess means to observe which young lady might suit Wycliffe as a duchess. There will be dinners, music, charitable discussions, formal introductions, and more eyes than you can imagine. Your uncle agreed that you may attend because the Vane family should appear united." Cecily turned slightly, letting one maid adjust the fall of her sleeve. "And because dear Beatrice is family." "How generous," Beatrice said. Cecily laughed. "Don't sound so solemn. You'll enjoy yourself if you remember not to compete." "With whom?" "With anyone. The insult was delivered lightly, but Lady Maud did not laugh. Lady Cecily has the lineage, the dowry, the age, and the temperament expected in such a position. You, Lady Beatrice, have an old name and a modest manner. Both may be useful if you do not try to make them more than they are. Beatrice felt the words land exactly where they were aimed. Not at her pride, which had learned endurance, but at the quiet room inside her where she still remembered her father's hand covering hers as he taught her to sign her name. He had died with debts he had hidden badly and tenderness he had never hidden at all. After his funeral, people had begun speaking of Beatrice as though she were a chair that needed placing. She had become useful in corners, convenient in family arrangements, welcome when she made others shine brighter by standing near them. The pearl sash warmed beneath her fingers. I understand my position, Lady Maud. I hope you do. The older woman's gaze moved to the gown. That sash calls attention to itself. Then I shall have to behave so quietly that no one looks below my face. Cecily gave a little sigh. You see? Sharp again. The travelling clock on the mantel struck 11. Downstairs, footmen carried trunks through the hall. The carriage to Hampshire would leave within the quarter hour. Lady Maud turned away, already finished with Beatrice in the manner of those who believed correction was a form of charity. Cecily lingered. For one brief second, the sweetness left her face. Her gaze fell again to the sash, to the place where the clasp lay hidden beneath Beatrice's hand. How brave of you, she said, almost tenderly, to wear something so easily noticed. Then she was gone, followed by the whisper of rose silk and the soft obedience of servants. Beatrice stood alone in the dressing room. For a moment, the needle, the pearls, the pale gown, and Nell's warning seemed to gather around her like witnesses. She could remove the sash. She could choose a plain ribbon and arrive at Halewick Park exactly as they wished her to arrive, diminished before the contest had even begun. No one would laugh at a woman who had made herself invisible in advance. No one would need to. She crossed to the looking-glass. The woman reflected there was not young enough to be called fresh, not rich enough to be called eligible, and not meek enough to be called wise. Yet her spine was straight. Her eyes were clear. The ivory gown, old as it was, did not make her ashamed. It made her remember that her mother had once entered rooms without apology and that her father had never spoken to servants as if kindness reduced rank. Beatrice took up the needle and secured the final pearl. Her stitches were small, even, and stubborn. When she finished, she fastened the sash around her waist and turned until the repaired silk settled smoothly at her back. Downstairs, the family assembled beneath the painted ceiling of Avalmere House. The Earl was already impatient. Cecily glowed beneath her bonnet. Lady Maud watched every gesture as if society itself had employed her to prevent disorder. Beatrice descended last with her travelling cloak over one arm. Nell waited by the stair with a bonnet box and worry in her eyes. Beatrice paused beside her. Thank you for warning me. Please be careful, my lady. I intend to be. Outside, the carriages stood ready, lacquered black beneath the spring sun. London smelled of damp stone, horse leather, and flowering trees in guarded squares. Beatrice stepped into the second carriage, the one assigned to poorer relations, extra shawls, and luggage that did not require delicate handling. As the wheels began to turn, she looked once through the window at Avalmere House, with its white steps and polished brass and windows that had reflected every version of her obedience. Then the carriage rolled westward, toward Hampshire, Halewick Park, and the cold-eyed Duke who, according to every whisper in London, noticed everything. Beatrice rested one gloved hand over the pearl sash at her waist. She did not yet know that before the week was out, half a room would see it torn from her. She did not yet know that the Duke of Wycliffe would be watching when it happened. But she knew, with a certainty that steadied her breathing, that if they meant to make her small, they would have to do it in front of witnesses. Halewick Park did not welcome Lady Beatrice Vane so much as measure her. The house rose from the Hampshire green after nearly 60 miles of road, pale stone spread wide beneath a slate roof, with wings that seemed built to remind visitors how long power could survive in one family when money, land, and obedience all travelled in the same direction. Beatrice saw the long gallery windows first, gleaming above the entrance like watchful eyes. Then she saw the line of servants waiting on the steps, the black and silver Wycliffe livery, the footmen motionless as carved figures, the butler descending with the grave expression of a man who could tell a duchess from a dependent cousin before either removed her gloves. Cecily leaned forward in the carriage opposite her, unable to hide her pleasure. "There it is," she whispered. "It looks exactly as a duchy should." Lady Maud Carrow adjusted one glove finger. "Remember that everything here is a test, even what appears to be comfort." Her eyes flicked toward Beatrice. "Especially comfort." Beatrice kept her hand resting lightly at her waist, where the pearl sash lay beneath her travelling cloak. "Then I shall try not to enjoy the cushions too much." Cecily gave a soft laugh, but Lady Maud did not. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Cool country air swept in, smelling of cut grass, rain-damp gravel, and smoke from chimneys far older than anyone waiting below them. Beatrice stepped down after Cecily, careful not to let the hem of her ivory gown brush the wheel. She was aware at once of how little she possessed. Cecily had 3 trunks, 1 hat box, a jewel case, a writing box, and a maid with hands full of silk-wrapped parcels. Beatrice had 1 modest trunk, a bonnet box, and the gown she had repaired herself. Yet the butler bowed to her with perfect correctness. Lady Beatrice Vane. The sound of her name, spoken without pity, steadied her more than it should have. Inside, Hailwick Park unfolded in polished floors, high ceilings, ancestral portraits, and corridors wide enough for secrets to travel without touching the walls. Guests had already arrived. Their voices drifted from the morning room and the great saloon, low, bright, and alert. This was not an ordinary house party, no matter how elegantly everyone pretended otherwise. The Dowager Duchess of Wycliffe had invited families of rank, fortune, and usefulness under the gentle phrases of music, charity, and country air. Every mother knew why she had come. Every daughter knew why she had packed her prettiest gowns. Every gentleman with debts knew which families might soon become more powerful by marriage. Beatrice felt the machinery of it before anyone explained a word. A lady was not merely entering a house. She was entering consideration. Lady Maud guided Cecily toward the staircase, already murmuring instructions about changing before tea. Rose silk for arrival was wise. Blue for dinner. Pearls, not diamonds, until the Duchess has admired your restraint. Cecily looked back at Beatrice with a smile made of honey and warning. "You may wear ivory again, I suppose. It will help people remember which of us is meant to be seen." Beatrice was spared an answer by the arrival of the housekeeper, Mrs. Pelham, who approached with a curtsy and a practical gaze. "Lady Beatrice, your room is in the East Passage. It is quiet there. I was told you might prefer light for reading." Beatrice looked at her. The kindness was too specific to be accidental. That is thoughtful of someone. Her Grace notices preferences when they are useful, Mrs. Pelham said. The words were neutral, but Beatrice heard the deeper message. At Hailwick Park, being noticed could be either protection or danger. By late afternoon, the guests gathered for tea in the long saloon, where the windows opened toward a terrace and the conversation had been arranged as carefully as the flowers. The Dowager Duchess sat near the hearth in dove-grey silk, erect and composed, with a face that age had sharpened rather than softened. Her hair was white beneath a cap of fine lace, and her eyes moved through the room with terrifying economy. She did not chatter. She collected evidence. Beside her, Lady Maud presented Cecily with the air of a person unveiling a successful investment. "Lady Cecily Vane, Your Grace. Daughter of the Earl of Avalmere. Accomplished in music, French, and household management." Cecily curtsied beautifully. "Your Grace, I'm honored to be received at Hailwick." "Are you?" or the Dowager asked. Cecily's smile paused for the smallest possible instant. "Very much." "Then you are either sincere or well-trained." "Both have their uses." A faint ripple of amusement crossed the room. Cecily recovered, but color touched her cheeks. Beatrice, standing a few paces behind, lowered her gaze before anyone could see the corner of her mouth move. Then Lady Maud turned, as though remembering an extra ribbon in a drawer. "And Lady Beatrice Vane. Also of the Avalmere family." The Dowager's eye settled on Beatrice. They did not slide away. "The late Earl's daughter." Beatrice curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace." Your father contributed to the Wycliffe Relief Fund during the winter of '46. Beatrice had not expected the blow of memory. Her father had sent money he could hardly spare because a flood in the north had left tenant families without roofs. She remembered her mother arguing softly that generosity did not pay creditors. She remembered her father saying, "No, but neither does fear." Beatrice lifted her head. He believed hunger should not be asked to wait until a gentleman's accounts were convenient. The dowager looked at her for one silent second. "A costly principle." "Yes, your grace." "And did he teach you accounts as well as principles?" "Only enough to know when a generous sum has been made smaller by careless arithmetic." Somewhere to Beatrice's left, Lady Maud inhaled. Across the room, one of the young ladies covered a smile with her teacup. The dowager did not smile. She reached for a paper on the small table beside her and held it out. "Then tell me whether Mr. Gresham has miscopied the figure for the widow's coal allotment." Beatrice crossed the carpet, aware of Cecily's gaze on her back and the sudden stillness of several mothers who had not expected the poor relation to be asked anything beyond whether she preferred tea or lemonade. She took the paper. The columns were neat. The error was not. "The total is short by £12, your grace. The third parish has been entered twice at the lower amount." "Are you certain?" "No, your grace. I would be certain after seeing the original ledger. But I would not sign this." The dowager took the paper back. "Good." The word fell lightly, but it changed the room. "Not much." "Enough." Beatrice stepped back to her place, pulse steady, face calm. Near the far wall, a gentleman she did not know watched her with a lazy smile that failed to reach his eyes. He had pale hair, handsome features grown soft at the edges, and the restless elegance of a man whose coat cost more than his conscience. A footman whispered his name while passing with the tea tray. "Mr. Edmund Vale." Beatrice remembered it because Mr. Vale's gaze moved not to her face after a moment, but to her waist, where the pearl sash rested beneath the fall of her cloak. The gathering shifted toward music after tea. Cecily played first, and she played well, with graceful wrists and an expression trained to suggest feeling without ever surrendering to it. The applause was warm. Lady Maud glowed. Two other young ladies sang. A third recited a translation with more courage than skill. Beatrice remained near the edge of the room, where the patterned carpet met the shadow of a tall palm. It was a familiar place. From there, she could watch without being accused of watching. She saw Lady Maud speak to Mr. Vale near the bookcase. She saw Cecily's maid appear briefly at the saloon door, though no lady had rung. She saw Mr. Vale glanced toward the ballroom corridor and then toward the high archway leading beneath the long gallery. A moment later, Cecily's maid moved in that direction. The gesture was small. Too small for accusation. Too deliberate to dismiss. Beatrice felt Nell's warning return, clear as a hand on her sleeve. "How does it fasten? Tie or clasp? Is the back seam strong?" A bell sounded softly from somewhere in the hall. The dowager rose, and conversation obeyed her at once. "Tomorrow afternoon, the Duke will receive formal introductions in the ballroom," she said. "This house has no fondness for spectacle, but society does enjoy calling duty by prettier names. You will each be presented according to family order and rank. After that, dinner will proceed as usual." A murmur passed through the room. Mothers straightened. Daughters looked down, then up again. Cecily's hand tightened around her music. Lady Maud's expression sharpened with satisfaction. Beatrice remained still, but the air seemed to narrow around her. Presentation order meant visibility. Visibility meant comparison. Comparison meant the pearl sash would be seen by every person in the house. The dowager's gaze traveled across the guests and stopped, briefly, on Beatrice. Then it lifted toward the long gallery above the saloon. Beatrice followed the movement before she could stop herself. A man stood there in the shadowed upper passage, one hand resting on the rail, dark frock coat cut with severe perfection, face unreadable from the distance. He had not been announced. He did not need to be. Every sound in the room altered because he was present. The Duke of Wycliffe looked down at the assembled ladies, not with admiration, not with boredom, but with the cold attention of a man listening for the one false note in a well-practiced hymn. For one suspended breath, his gaze passed over Cecily, Lady Maud, the piano, the matrons, the anxious smiles. Then it reached Beatrice. It stopped. She did not curtsy. He was too far away, and no introduction had been made. She simply stood where she was, one hand resting lightly over the sash that someone had already taken too much interest in, and met his gaze as steadily as rank allowed. The Duke did not smile. Neither did she. Then Lady Maud's voice cut softly through the room, sweet enough for others and sharp enough for Beatrice alone. A sentimental inclusion from the Avelmere family, she murmured to a nearby matron. One must be kind to poor relations. The Duke's eyes moved. Not to Beatrice's gown. Not to Cecily's beauty. To Lady Maud. The room seemed, very quietly, to hold its breath. By the next afternoon, Hailwick Park had learned how to breathe in expectation. The ballroom doors stood open before 3 o'clock, and footmen moved through the passage with the soundless precision of men trained to carry the weight of other people's futures without appearing to notice. The long room had been polished until the chandeliers seemed doubled on the floor. Chairs lined the walls for mothers, guardians, and the older ladies whose opinions travelled farther than their carriages. At the far end, beneath the musicians' gallery, a small space had been cleared for each young lady to cross, curtsy, and receive formal introduction. It was not called a contest. No one at Hailwick Park would have used so vulgar a word. Yet every glance, every fan, every adjustment of a glove confessed the truth. A duchess was being measured. Lady Beatrice Vane stood near the rear of the line with her hands folded lightly before her waist. She had chosen the ivory gown again because retreat would have pleased them too much. The pearl sash lay smooth around her middle, repaired, modest, and visible enough to draw the eye if one wished to be unkind. She had slept poorly after seeing the Duke of Wycliffe in the gallery. Not because of his rank. Rank had surrounded her all her life, sometimes warmly, often coldly. It was the stillness of him that remained. He had looked at Lady Maud as though he had heard the cruelty beneath the courtesy, and then he had looked at Beatrice as though she were not a spare piece in someone else's arrangement. That was more dangerous than insult. Insult was familiar. Being seen was not. Cecily stood several places ahead, dressed in pale blue silk that made her hair look almost golden enough to be innocent. Lady Maud hovered nearby, whispering corrections no one else could hear. A little slower when you cross. Not eager. Don't forget that restraint is more expensive than beauty. Cecily's gaze slid back to Beatrice. Her smile was brief and private. Don't worry, cousin. I doubt anyone will keep you standing long. Beatrice answered without moving her lips far enough to attract attention. Then I shall be grateful for the mercy. You always do sound brave when nothing has happened yet. The words should not have struck deeply, but they did. Nothing had happened yet. That was the cruelty of waiting. A woman could be ruined by a moment she had not reached, by a whisper that had not yet found its listener, by a hand that had not yet moved. Near the side entrance, Beatrice noticed Cecily's maid standing half-hidden behind the velvet drapery. The maid should not have been there. Her presence sent a small chill through Beatrice's fingers. Then Mr. Edmund Vale appeared near the archway, elegant, idle, smiling as if he had no reason to be anywhere and therefore belonged everywhere. His gaze touched Beatrice's waist, then Cecily's gloves. He looked away too quickly. The Dowager Duchess entered through the main doors, and the room settled. She wore grey silk again, with diamonds at her throat that did not sparkle so much as command. Behind her came Alastair Harcourt, Duke of Wycliffe. He was dressed in a dark frock coat, severe black waistcoat, and gloves the colour of smoke. He did not walk like a man entering entertainment. He walked like a man entering judgment. Every lady in the room became aware of her posture. Every mother became aware of her daughter. Beatrice became aware of her own breathing. The Duke took his place not beside the Dowager, as expected, but on the upper gallery, one level above the room, where he could see the entire floor. A ripple moved through the guests. Cecily looked briefly annoyed before she remembered to look serene. Lady Maud's mouth tightened. How theatrical, someone whispered. No, the Dowager said from her chair, without turning her head. Merely practical. The presentations began. Lady Helena Armitage crossed first, pretty and pink, with a curtsy so deep it nearly became apology. Lady Rosalind Fry followed, calm and tall, answering the dowager's question about parish schools with enough confidence to satisfy her mother. Cecily was called forth. She moved beautifully. Even Beatrice, who loved her little, could admit that. Cecily crossed the polished floor as if born from its reflection, curtsied to the dowager, then lifted her face toward the gallery. "Your Grace," she said, her voice soft and clear, "I'm honored to be received in your house." The Duke inclined his head. "No more. No less." Cecily's smile held, but Beatrice saw the effort beneath it. A few more names were called. Each young lady crossed, curtsied, withdrew. The room's interest sharpened as the line shortened. Beatrice felt the weight of curiosity gathering around her. Poor relation. Late Earl's daughter. Clever enough to be inconvenient. Not rich enough to be forgiven for it. At last the steward's voice sounded. "Lady Beatrice Vane." Silence followed. Not complete silence. The crueler kind, woven with breathing and the soft closing of fans. Beatrice stepped forward. The ivory skirt moved quietly around her feet. She fixed her eyes first on the dowager, not on Cecily, not on Lady Maud, and not on the Duke above. A lady could not control what others saw, but she could choose where she looked while they saw it. Halfway across the floor, Cecily shifted. It was a small movement, perfectly timed to appear accidental. She turned as if making room for Beatrice to pass, then gave a delicate little start. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she murmured. Her gloved hand caught the pearl sash at Beatrice's back. For 1 second, everything held. Beatrice felt the tug before she heard the sound. A quick, tearing whisper. Not loud. Not dramatic. Worse than loud. Intimate. Final. The sash gave way beneath Cecily's hand. The weakened seam opened across the back of the gown, and the old lining showed beneath, pale and patched where Beatrice had mended it too many times by candlelight. A string of pearls scattered across the floor with tiny, bright clicks. The room inhaled. Cecily drew back, eyes wide, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Beatrice, I didn't mean to. I barely touched you." Someone gave a small laugh. Someone else smothered another behind a fan. Beatrice did not move. Heat rose along her neck, not from shame alone, but from the terrible knowledge that everyone had seen the poverty she had tried to make graceful. The turned fabric. The old repair. The proof that Lady Beatrice Vane had come to a duchess's house wearing hope stitched over want. She wanted to reach behind herself. She did not. She wanted to run. She did not. Running would give the room a shape for its cruelty. Running would make her humiliation look like confession. She stood very still. Above her, the Duke had also gone still. From the gallery, he had seen what the room below had not. He had seen Cecily's hand close before the stumble. He had seen the deliberate pull. More than that, he had seen the tiny bright flash at the edge of the sash before it tore, the mark of a cut made earlier by a careful blade. His hand tightened on the rail. Lady Maud rose halfway from her chair. What an unfortunate accident. The first laugh grew bolder. It came from a young gentleman near the door who perhaps thought himself safe because no one of consequence ever punished laughter at a poor woman's expense. Beatrice turned toward the dowager. Her voice came out quieter than she expected, but it did not break. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. I'm afraid I brought more truth into the room than silk." The dowager's face changed. Not softened. Sharpened. Before she could speak, the Duke descended from the gallery. No one announced him. The rhythm of his steps on the stairs cut through the room cleanly enough that every fan stilled. He crossed the ballroom without haste. That was what made people afraid. Anger hurried lesser men. The Duke of Wycliffe seemed to have all the time in England. He stopped beside the dowager, took the folded shawl from the back of her chair with a brief glance that asked permission and received it, then stepped toward Beatrice. He did not touch her. He held the shawl out so that she could take it if she wished. The distinction struck her even through the humiliation. He was not covering her like a possession. He was offering her the means to cover herself. Beatrice took the shawl. Her fingers brushed the wool, not his hand. She drew it around her shoulders. Only then did the Duke bend and pick up the torn length of pearl sash from the floor. A few loose pearls rested against his glove. He studied the edge of the fabric. His expression did not change, but the room changed around him. Cecily began to speak. "Your Grace, I'm terribly clumsy. I don't know how it happened." "No," he said. "I do." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Cecily's face lost colour. Lady Maud stepped forward. "Your Grace, surely we needn't make distress out of a mishap." The Duke looked at her then, and whatever she had meant to say next died with admirable speed. The young gentleman near the door shifted as if he hoped to become furniture. The Duke turned slowly, letting his gaze pass over every guest, every mother, every daughter, every witness who had chosen silence and called it manners. "If you laugh now, you'll explain to me why cruelty has become a qualification for a duchess." No one laughed. No one breathed loudly. Beatrice felt the shawl heavy around her shoulders and the ruin of the gown beneath it. She should have felt smaller. Instead, for one strange and aching moment, she felt the room shrink around the man who had refused to let it devour her. He turned back to her, and when he spoke again, his voice was low enough for only her and perhaps the dowager to hear. "You owe them nothing. Not even your composure." The word struck harder than pity would have. Pity would have asked her to break. This gave her permission not to. Beatrice lifted her chin. "Then I won't give it to them." Something moved in his eyes. Not warmth. Not yet. Recognition. He looked down at the torn sash in his hand, then towards Cecily, whose tears had arrived too late to look natural. "This presentation is concluded," he said. "The guests will remain at Hailwick Park until I understand exactly whose hand was on that sash." Lady Maud whispered, "Your Grace, that sounds almost like an accusation." The Duke folded the torn fabric once over his gloved fingers. "No, Lady Maud. It's a promise." The ballroom emptied as if the air itself had been ordered out. No one hurried, because no one wished to appear guilty of hurry, but the guests moved with the stiff obedience of people who had discovered that laughter could suddenly become evidence. Lady Maud Carrow gathered Cecily with one hand at her elbow and an expression of practiced outrage on her face. Cecily's tears had not fallen. They shone prettily, unused, while her gaze followed the torn sash in the Duke's hand as though the small strip of silk had become more dangerous than any accusation spoken aloud. Beatrice did not watch them leave. The Dowager Duchess touched her arm with 2 fingers, no more than propriety allowed, and said, "Come with me, child." The word should have wounded her. It did not. There was no pity in it. Only command. Beatrice walked beside the older woman through the side doors and into a corridor panelled in dark oak, the shawl drawn close around her shoulders. Each step reminded her of the gown beneath it, opened at the back, the old lining exposed, the careful work undone before witnesses. She kept her chin level because servants stood at attention along the passage. A footman looked down too quickly. A housemaid pressed one hand to her apron and then remembered herself. Beatrice wished to tell them she was not made of glass. She wished to believe it. The morning room lay at the eastern side of the house, though the afternoon light entered it warmly through tall windows that overlooked a clipped lawn and a narrow border of white flowers. The Dowager closed the door herself before the butler could do it. "Mrs. Pelham," she said to the housekeeper waiting within, "send for Mrs. Alder from the still room. She has the steadiest hand with a needle. And bring my blue shawl. The plain one. Not the embroidered thing Lady Maud admires." Mrs. Pelham curtsied. "At once, Your Grace." Beatrice turned. "Your Grace, I do not wish to trouble the household." "You are not troubling the household. Someone else has done that." The Dowager pointed to a chair near the fire. "Sit before pride makes you faint." Beatrice sat because her knees had begun to tremble, and pride, while useful, had never been a substitute for bones. The room was quiet after the ballroom. Too quiet. The clock on the mantel clicked. Somewhere beyond the door, footsteps passed and faded. She stared at the pattern in the carpet until the tiny green vines blurred. "I should have removed it," she said. "The sash." The Dowager's face turned toward her sharply. "You should have done nothing of the kind. A maid warned me that someone had asked about it." And did that someone also ask whether your dignity was fastened by a clasp? Beatrice looked up. The dowager's voice was dry, but her eyes were not unkind. No, your grace. Then the fault lies where the hand was, not where the cloth was. The door opened after a soft knock. The Duke entered with Mrs. Pelham behind him. In his gloved hand he still held the torn pearl sash. Beatrice felt the room alter, not because he was loud or imposing in any theatrical way, but because he brought decision with him. He stopped a respectful distance from her chair. Lady Beatrice. His gaze did not move to the ruined gown. It stayed on her face. May I ask whether you are injured? The question was simple. It should have been easy. Yet no one had asked it in the ballroom. They had looked at fabric, scandal, presentation order, Cecily's tears. Not at whether Beatrice herself had been hurt. No, your grace. Her voice held. Only embarrassed. Embarrassment is often what society calls an injury when it wishes to avoid naming the weapon. The dowager glanced at him. Alistair. I am aware of what I said. He removed his gloves slowly, then laid the sash on the small table beside the window. Mrs. Pelham, no servant is to discuss what occurred in the ballroom. Not below stairs. Not in the laundry. Not with visiting maids. If any guest asks, the answer is that Her Grace has given no permission for gossip. Yes, Your Grace. The same applies to the guest rooms. Any lady or gentleman who treats this as amusement will discover that Hailwick Park can become inhospitable with remarkable speed. Mrs. Pelham's mouth nearly softened. I shall make that understood. When she left, the Duke turned back to Beatrice. I have sent for a sempstress. Until she arrives, my grandmother's shawl will serve better than the one you were forced to take in haste. Forced? Beatrice repeated. I took it willingly. After being left no dignified alternative. There was anger beneath the words, controlled so tightly that it seemed colder than calm. That is not the same thing. The dowager took her place on the sofa, establishing beyond question that the conversation remained proper. The Duke stood by the window, the torn sash between them like a silent witness. Lady Beatrice, do you wish to leave Hailwick Park? The question struck her more sharply than any insult could have done. Not because it was cruel, but because it gave her a door. For years, others had placed her, moved her, included her, dismissed her, and praised her for being easy to arrange. No one had asked whether she wanted to stay in a room where she had been humiliated. No one had asked whether she wished to retreat with honor intact. She looked at the sash. A few pearls still clung to it. Others were gone. If I leave now, they will say I could not bear the shame. They may say that regardless. Yes. But if I remain, they must say it while looking at me. The Duke was silent. The dowager's eyes lowered for a moment, as if concealing approval. Beatrice folded her hands tightly under the shawl. I do not wish to leave, Your Grace. Not today. Not because someone tried to make departure look like confession. The Duke inclined his head. Then you shall stay. The words were not tender. They were better than tender. They were an arrangement of the room around her choice. He drew the sash closer to the light. May I show you something? Beatrice rose. The dowager did not object, so she crossed to the table. The Duke touched the torn edge with the blunt side of a letter opener, not with his bare hand, as though the silk were evidence in a matter he refused to contaminate. Here. He angled it toward her. This portion tore unevenly when it was pulled. But this section was weakened before the presentation. It is too clean. A small blade made this cut. Beatrice leaned nearer. The line was tiny, nearly hidden beneath the pearls. Once seen, it could not be unseen. Her breath slowed. A strange steadiness entered her. Accident had been insulting. Intention was clarifying. Then she meant it to tear. The Duke's jaw moved once. Someone did. You saw her hand. I saw enough to distrust the accident. I did not see who made the earlier cut. You do not need to protect her name from mine. His gaze lifted to hers. I have no intention of protecting any name from truth. But if I accuse Lady Cecily before I can prove the cut, Lady Maud will turn the room into a theatre of female nerves and wounded innocence. You will become the source of discord. She will become the weeping cousin. I would prefer not to give them a stage they already know how to use. Beatrice looked away first. Not from fear. From the uncomfortable recognition that he was right. Lady Maud could turn almost anything into an indictment of the person least able to defend herself. So we wait. We inquire. That is a colder word. It is a more useful one. A knock sounded. Mrs. Pelham returned with the blue shawl and a plain-faced woman carrying a sewing case. Behind them came a footman, pale with unease. The housekeeper looked at the Duke. "Your Grace, I thought you should know at once." Mrs. Alder found the ribbon knife missing from the sewing room. The small one with the pearl handle. It was there this morning before the presentation. Beatrice felt the dowager's attention sharpen. The Duke did not move. Who had access? Household staff, visiting maids, and any guest who passed through the service corridor before luncheon. The footman swallowed. "Begging pardon, Your Grace. I saw Mr. Vale near that corridor. He said he had lost his way." The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Vale has a talent for losing himself precisely where he should not be." The seamstress helped Beatrice behind a screen with the dowager present, and in a few efficient minutes the ruined gown was made secure enough for Beatrice to return to her chamber without further indignity. The blue shawl covered what could not yet be mended. When she emerged, the Duke had placed the torn sash in a folded square of linen. He separated one loose thread and set it into a small envelope from the writing desk. "For comparison," he said. Beatrice extended her hand. "The rest is mine." He looked at her, then placed the folded linen in her palm without protest. "Yes. It is." That simple agreement settled something inside her that the shawl could not cover. The dowager rose. "You will rest until dinner." "Your Grace, I would rather not hide in my room." Rest is not hiding unless one uses it as surrender. The Duke stepped back toward the door. "This evening, you will dine if you choose. You will not be required to appear. You will not be forbidden to appear." Beatrice looked at him. "You are very careful with choices. I have seen what happens when families treat them as ornaments." The words revealed almost nothing. Somehow, they revealed enough. An hour later, in the quiet of the East Passage, Beatrice found the anonymous note slipped beneath her chamber door. The paper was folded once. No seal. No signature. Only a neat black hand that made her skin go cold. "A torn dress is kinder than a ruined name. Leave before breakfast." By the time the dressing bell sounded for dinner, the anonymous note had ceased to be paper and had become a second garment beneath Lady Beatrice Vane's gown, colder than silk and harder to conceal. She had read it once beside the chamber door, once at the writing desk, and once more after folding it into the small inner pocket of her reticule. "A torn dress is kinder than a ruined name. Leave before breakfast." The words did not frighten her in the way the writer had intended. They clarified the shape of the room into which she was about to walk. Someone had not acted in a moment of temper. Someone had planned humiliation, watched it happen, and then sent a warning before the wound had even closed. Beatrice stood before the glass while Mrs. Alder's careful temporary stitches held the back of the ivory gown in place. The blue shawl from the Dowager Duchess rested over her shoulders, plain, warm, and unmistakably borrowed from authority rather than pity. Her pearl sash, torn and folded, lay hidden in her drawer. She had chosen not to wear another ribbon. Let them notice its absence. Let them wonder whether absence was fear or accusation. A soft knock came. Nell entered with a candle and eyes full of anxious loyalty. "My lady, you don't have to go down." Beatrice fastened one glove. "No, I do not." "Then why go?" "Because if I remain here, they will dine upon the story without me." Nell looked toward the door as though the corridor might be listening. "They're saying it was an accident." "Of course they are. Accidents are so convenient. They require no conscience." The maid's mouth trembled, but Beatrice touched her sleeve gently before fear could become tears. "You warned me." "That was brave." "It didn't help." It helped me know I was not mad to notice. That seemed to steady the girl. Beatrice took up her reticule, feeling the note inside it like a small, poisonous heart, and left the chamber. The passage outside was quiet. Too quiet. At the top of the stairs, she saw the Duke of Wycliffe waiting below in the hall, not directly in her path, not as though he had come to escort her, but positioned where anyone looking up would understand that her descent was being observed by the master of the house. His face gave nothing away. His dark coat was severe, his posture still, and his gaze lifted only when she reached the first landing. Beatrice paused, one gloved hand on the banister. "Your Grace." "Lady Beatrice." He did not ask whether she had changed her mind. He did not congratulate her courage, which would have made it sound like performance. He merely said, "The dining room is less forgiving than the ballroom. Knives are expected there." Despite herself, her mouth softened. "Then I shall be relieved if they remain on the table." Something almost like amusement touched his eyes and vanished. "If you wish to withdraw at any point, you may give the dowager your glove. She will understand." Beatrice looked down at the glove on her hand. "And if I do not wish to withdraw?" "Then no one will presume you should." It was the sort of answer that steadied more than sympathy. She descended the remaining stairs. He offered his arm only when a footman opened the dining room doors and the line of guests turned to see who entered. He offered. He did not take. Beatrice placed her fingers lightly on his sleeve. The room changed. Not dramatically. Society was too well trained to gasp when silence could wound more elegantly. Yet conversations thinned. Lady Maud Carrow sat rigid near the center of the table, her expression arranged into sorrowful concern. Cecily, in blue silk and pearls, looked up with a sweetness that trembled at the edges. Mr. Edmund Vale stood near the sideboard with a glass in his hand, watching as if the evening had promised sport and then charged him admission. The Dowager Duchess took her place at the head of the table. The Duke remained standing until Beatrice was seated. Then, with a calm that made Lady Maud's eyes sharpen, he altered the seating card beside his own plate and handed it to the footman. "Lady Beatrice will sit here." A pause. A very small one. Enough to be heard. Lady Maud smiled. "Your Grace, I believe the arrangement placed Lady Beatrice farther down the table." Then the arrangement was poorly informed. Cecily's fork shifted against porcelain. Mr. Vale lowered his glass. Beatrice sat at the Duke's right, aware of every face turning away just late enough to prove they had looked. Dinner began with soup served in white china bowls edged in silver. The conversation, at first, behaved itself. There were comments on the weather, the roads from London, the music promised after dinner. Then Lady Maud lifted her spoon and glanced at Beatrice's shawl. "I hope you are recovered from the afternoon's little misfortune, Lady Beatrice." Little misfortune. Two soft words laid like a veil over a deliberate tear. Beatrice tasted the soup before answering. "I am recovered from the surprise of it." Lady Maud's smile deepened. "How admirable. A young lady's composure is often more important than the matter that tests it." The Duke set down his spoon. Not loudly. The sound still reached the end of the table. Only to those who prefer composure to justice. Lady Maud inclined her head. "Justice, Your Grace?" That is a grave word for torn silk. Silk is rarely the point when a hand chooses where to pull. Cecily gave a tiny breath. "Your Grace, I'm still so distressed. I barely touched her. Beatrice knows I wouldn't hurt her." Beatrice turned to her. "I know what you said happened." The sentence was mild. It landed like a pin placed under lace. Cecily's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" Only that memory is sometimes kinder to the hand than to the truth. At the far end of the table, an older matron coughed into her napkin. Lady Maud's gaze cooled. "My dear Lady Beatrice, bitterness does not become you." Beatrice looked at her across the candles. Nor does charity when it requires an audience. For one full second, no one moved. Then the Duke reached for the wine decanter and said, as if the table had merely discussed the turnips, "Lady Beatrice, my steward tells me you corrected the allotment for the widow's coal fund yesterday. Would you explain the error?" It was not rescue by interruption. It was a door opened into competence. Beatrice understood and stepped through. The third parish was entered at the lower sum, though the number of households matched the larger allotment. If the account had been signed, £12 would have been withheld from the families most likely to spend winter without sufficient fuel. The dowager nodded once. And would you have noticed that without being asked? Yes, Your Grace. Why? Beatrice felt the table listening despite itself. Because charity that loses its way in arithmetic is still hunger at the other end. The dowager's eyes brightened. Precisely. The conversation shifted then, unwillingly but completely. A gentleman asked about parish records. Lady Rosalind Fry asked whether women might be trained to read household accounts before marriage. Beatrice answered carefully, never too eagerly, never shrinking. She did not win the room. She survived it in full view, and that was more irritating to her enemies than triumph would have been. Cecily's smile grew fixed. Lady Maud stopped pretending to eat. Near the sideboard, Mr. Vale murmured something to a footman, then moved toward the doors under the excuse of retrieving a dropped handkerchief. Beatrice noticed because the Duke noticed. His gaze followed Vale through the reflection in a pier glass, then moved, almost imperceptibly, to Lady Maud. A few minutes later, when the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room and the gentlemen remained, Beatrice saw Lady Maud pause near the corridor. Mr. Vale stood half-hidden beyond a screen of potted palms. Lady Maud passed him a folded note or envelope so quickly that a less watchful eye would have called it nothing. The Duke, standing beside the mantel with a glass untouched in his hand, saw it as well. His expression did not change. That made it more dangerous. In the drawing-room, Cecily approached Beatrice with a shawl of her own draped over one arm. "Poor cousin," she said softly. "You must let me lend you a proper gown tomorrow. I can't bear for people to think our family careless." Beatrice looked at the costly fabric, then at Cecily's lovely, anxious face. "I would not wish to borrow generosity that must be displayed before witnesses." Cecily's sweetness vanished for half a heartbeat. "You imagine too much." "Perhaps. But I have begun to prefer imagination to blindness." Before Cecily could answer, the gentleman entered. The Duke crossed not to Beatrice, but to the dowager, and spoke quietly. The dowager's fan stilled. Beatrice saw the message pass between them. Not alarm. Confirmation. The evening ended early, though no one said so. Guests drifted toward chambers under the weight of unsatisfied curiosity. Beatrice walked the east passage alone until the Duke's voice stopped her near the turn toward her room. "Lady Beatrice." She turned. He stood several paces away, holding something small between his fingers. This was found outside the blue chamber. The blue chamber belonged to Cecily. In his palm lay a single length of pearl thread, pale, twisted, and unmistakably familiar. Beatrice did not touch it. "From my sash." "It appears so." "Then the accident has begun to travel." The Duke's gaze met hers, steady and cold with purpose. "No. It has begun to leave a trail." Morning at Halewick Park arrived with the unnatural politeness that follows a scandal everyone has been ordered not to mention. Servants moved more softly than usual. Guests spoke too brightly at breakfast or not at all. Lady Beatrice Vane did not go down. She sent word through Mrs. Pelham that she preferred a tray in the small sitting room at the end of the East Passage, and because the Dowager Duchess had clearly approved the arrangement, no one dared call it retreat. The room had pale green walls, 2 tall windows, and a writing table placed where the light fell cleanly across paper, thread, and truth. Beatrice sat near that light with the torn pearl sash spread across her lap. She had not worn it that morning. She had not hidden it either. The silk lay open, its ruined edge visible, its false pearls scattered in a saucer beside her teacup. Every stitch she placed felt like an answer to the hand that had tried to make the sash a joke. She was not repairing it for beauty. Beauty had proved too fragile a defense. She was repairing it because broken things left untouched could be mistaken for things abandoned. The Dowager Duchess sat near the fire with her embroidery untouched in her lap, which Beatrice had already learned meant she was thinking. "You sew with resentment," the Dowager observed. Beatrice drew the thread through the silk. "I was hoping it looked like patience." Patience does not pull the needle quite so firmly. Then perhaps I'm not patient today. The dowager's mouth twitched, but she did not smile. Good. Patience is overrated when it is demanded only from the injured. Beatrice looked down before gratitude could show too plainly. Since the previous evening, she had turned the anonymous note over in her mind until the words had lost their surprise and gained weight. Leave before breakfast. She had not left. The house had noticed. That, too, was an answer. A knock came at the door. The dowager lifted her head. Come. The Duke of Wycliffe entered, stopping just inside the room until his grandmother gave the smallest nod. He carried no dramatic air of rescue this morning. He looked rested, stern, and entirely awake to danger. In one hand he held a folded paper. In the other, a narrow envelope. His gaze moved to Beatrice's work, then to her face. Lady Beatrice, may I ask about the sash, or would you prefer that I return later? The question was formal. The care inside it was not. Beatrice set the needle down. You may ask. Only if you are willing to answer. Your Grace, if I waited to be willing before discussing unpleasant things, society would have to invent a new pastime. The dowager made a dry sound that might have been approval. The Duke crossed to the table and remained standing, though a chair sat nearby. He did not presume intimacy. Mrs. Pelham found the missing ribbon knife. Beatrice's fingers stilled. Where? In a coal scuttle near the service passage behind the ballroom. That seems careless. It seems intended to be found by the wrong person. Unfortunately for whoever placed it there, Mrs. Pelham has a suspicious mind and an excellent memory. Beatrice breathed slowly. Was there pearl thread on it? A trace caught near the hinge. He opened the envelope and showed her a pale fibre sealed inside. He did not place it near her tea, which she noticed and appreciated. It will not prove who held it, but it proves the cut was no accident. Then Lady Maud will call it a household mishap. She already has. The Duke's voice remained cool. At breakfast, she suggested that older houses contain many small hazards. And Cecily? Lady Cecily looked grieved enough to satisfy anyone who prefers tears to thought. Beatrice picked up one loose pearl and rolled it between finger and thumb. She was always good at looking wounded by the consequences of her own hand. The words escaped more plainly than she intended. She expected rebuke. The Duke only said, "That is not a new observation." Beatrice looked up. He was watching her with the same still attention he had given the ballroom, but now it had narrowed into something more personal. Not possession. Not pity. Interest held under discipline. She returned to the sash because the thread made fewer demands than his eyes. This gown belonged to my mother, she said. It was altered for me after she died. My father said ivory suited sincerity more than vanity. I think he meant that we could no longer afford vanity. The dowager's embroidery remained untouched. The room listened. Beatrice continued before courage could fail. After he died, there were many things I could not keep. Horses. Books. Rooms. Silver my mother had loved. Even the right to be spoken of as if my future belonged first to me. But the gown remained because no creditor wanted old silk, and no cousin envied what had already faded. She touched the torn edge. I thought if I mended it well enough, no one would see what had been lost. The Duke's voice was quiet. They saw the wrong thing. They saw exactly what I feared. No. They saw old silk. They did not see the hand that kept it honorable. The needle blurred slightly before Beatrice forced her vision clear. She did not want tears in this room. Tears would make the moment smaller than it was. The Duke seemed to understand, because he looked away first. My mother hated rooms such as that ballroom, he said. The dowager's head turned, but she did not interrupt. She was praised for grace, beauty, softness, obedience. By the time I was old enough to notice, she had been complimented into silence. Every gathering made an ornament of her, and every ornament is expected not to speak when handled carelessly. Beatrice had heard many things about the late Duchess of Wycliffe. Beautiful. Delicate. Beloved. She had never heard lonely. Is that why you dislike this house party? She asked. I dislike any custom that teaches women to stand in a row while families discuss value. His mouth tightened. Yet I allowed it to happen under my own roof. The dowager looked at him then, and something old passed between grandmother and grandson. Beatrice understood enough not to ask. Instead, she picked up the needle again. Then perhaps you can begin by not allowing the wrong woman to be blamed for what happened in that row. That is my intention. Intention is not proof. No, the word was almost a concession. Which is why I came to ask whether you still wish to continue the inquiry. Beatrice looked at the torn sash, the missing pearls, the envelope with its sealed thread, and the bright square of morning beyond the window. Yes. The answer steadied her as soon as she spoke it. But I will not have the inquiry conducted as if I am a parcel being protected from weather. I wish to know what is found. I wish to decide what I can bear. That's fair, he said. The contraction made the sentence strangely human. Then, as if he heard it too, he added with more formality, more than fair. A small knock interrupted them. Nell entered with a curtsy so nervous that Beatrice almost rose. "Forgive me, Your Grace." "Your Grace." She looked helplessly between Duke and Dowager. "Mrs. Pelham said I was to bring this at once." She held out a visiting card and a folded message. The Dowager took them first, read the card, and passed it to the Duke. His face changed by no visible degree, yet the air tightened. "From Madame Leroy on Bond Street," he said. Beatrice knew the name. The modiste had once altered Cecily's gowns and had taken in Beatrice's old bodice at a discount after her father's death. "What does she say?" The Duke read aloud. "Her assistant recalls an inquiry made last week regarding the construction of an ivory gown belonging to a lady of the Avelmere family. The question concerned the fastening of a pearl sash and whether strain at the back seam would expose prior alterations." Nell's face went pale. Beatrice set down the needle very carefully. The Dowager's voice cut through the silence. "Who made the inquiry?" "She does not name the person in the note." The Duke folded the paper. "But she asks whether Lady Beatrice will call upon her in London, discreetly, if the matter concerns reputation." Beatrice felt the shape of the trap widen. The gown had been studied before Hailwick. Her humiliation had been fitted like a dress. "So it began before we arrived." "Yes," the Duke said. "And now they know you did not leave when warned." As if summoned by that truth, a footman appeared with the afternoon post. The Dowager broke one seal, read, and gave a humorless little laugh. "Lady Maud will be pleased. The Duchess of Norbury has invited the Wycliffe party to attend the opera in London tomorrow evening. Half the people in this house will see it as an opportunity to prove nothing happened." Beatrice lifted the sash from her lap. The torn seam ran through the silk, newly stitched but still visible. "Then perhaps I should prove I am not afraid to be seen." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "That will be dangerous." "So is hiding." He inclined his head, and this time the respect in the gesture was unmistakable. "Then we shall go to London." The Dowager finally took up her embroidery, as if the matter were settled because Beatrice had settled it. "Wear the sash if you choose," she said. Beatrice looked down at the uneven silver-grey thread she had used because it was the strongest in the basket. The repair would never disappear. "Good. I will," she said. "Not because it is mended perfectly." The Duke's eyes held hers. "Because it is yours." Beatrice drew the needle through once more, and the thread held. London received the Wycliffe party with gaslight, carriage wheels, and the particular hunger of a city that could smell scandal before it was spoken aloud. By 7 o'clock the next evening, the opera house was lit from pavement to cornice, its entrance crowded with liveried footmen, silk gowns, white gloves, and gentlemen who had come less for music than for whatever might be learned between acts. Lady Beatrice Vane sat in the Dowager Duchess's carriage with the repaired pearl sash fastened at her waist. The seam showed. She had not tried to hide it with lace or flowers. The silver-grey thread ran through the ivory silk like a quiet refusal. Across from her, the Dowager watched the passing lamps through the window, her profile as composed as any carved cameo. "If anyone asks whether you meant to display the repair," she said, "say yes." Beatrice looked down at her hands. "And if they ask why?" "Say you dislike wasting useful evidence." A small laugh escaped before Beatrice could stop it. It steadied her better than a sermon would have done. The carriage slowed. Outside, voices rose, then lowered as the Wycliffe crest became visible on the door. Beatrice felt attention gather before she even stepped down. News had travelled from Halewick Park faster than any official denial could follow. A torn gown. A poor relation. The Duke's interruption. Lady Cecily's tears. By now, the story had likely acquired ribbons of invention, each more decorative and poisonous than the last. The footman opened the door. The Duke of Wycliffe stood at the curb, dark and still beneath the opera house lamps, his gloved hand extended not to claim her but to help her descend without hesitation in front of London. "Lady Beatrice," he said. The crowd nearby shifted. A woman's fan paused halfway open. A gentleman leaned toward another and murmured behind his programme. Beatrice placed her hand on the Duke's and stepped onto the pavement. "Your Grace." His eyes moved once to the mended sash, then returned to her face. "You chose to wear it." "I did." "Good." The single word warmed her more than praise because it did not ask her to become softer for having been hurt. Behind them, Cecily emerged from Lady Maud's carriage in a gown of white satin trimmed with blue, looking as untouched by yesterday's disgrace as a portrait restored overnight. Lady Maud followed, her expression sorrowful and severe, as though she had personally been burdened with the task of forgiving everyone else. Mr. Edmund Vale appeared near the entrance steps, smiling into the crowd with a careless ease that made Beatrice's skin tighten. The Duke offered his arm. This time Beatrice accepted without delay. They entered beneath the watching eyes of half of London. The lobby glittered with chandeliers and polished mirrors, all designed to multiply the people one would rather face only once. The scent of perfume, wax, and damp wool rose around them. Conversations broke and rejoined in their wake. Beatrice heard fragments. "That is the cousin." "The ivory gown, yes." "He is escorting her himself." "How extraordinary." She walked steadily beside the Duke, aware of the repaired sash, aware of Cecily's gaze somewhere behind her, aware most of all that the Duke did not quicken his pace to spare her the scrutiny. He let them look. More than that, he made them understand that looking would not reduce her. At the grand staircase, the Duchess of Norbury descended with practised delight, welcoming the party with the bright voice of a woman who had invited trouble and expected to be thanked for the entertainment. "Wycliffe, how rare to see you bring such consequence to my dull little evening." "Your Grace's evenings are rarely dull," the Duke replied. "They are merely advertised as music." The Duchess laughed, but her eyes moved to Beatrice. "Lady Beatrice Vane. I have heard your name several times today." Beatrice curtsied. "Then I hope at least one version was accurate." The Duchess's brows lifted. "Clever too. How inconvenient for your enemies." Before Beatrice could answer, a folded letter struck the marble near her slipper and slid to a stop against the hem of her gown. It had fallen from nowhere obvious. Not from her reticule. Not from the Duke's hand. For one clear second, no one moved. Then Mr. Vale, standing several paces away, said in a voice pitched just softly enough to sound reluctant, "Lady Beatrice, I believe you've dropped something." The crowd turned. Beatrice looked at the letter. Cream paper. Dark red wax. No direction written on the outside, but the fold had opened just enough to show a line of script within. Her name. Her breath slowed. The trap had come sooner than expected. The Duke bent first, but he did not pick it up. He looked at Beatrice. "Is it yours?" She understood what he was offering. Not rescue. A chance to answer before the room answered for her. "No." Mr. Vale gave a faint, wounded smile. "How odd. It seems determined to rest at your feet." Lady Maud moved forward, one hand pressed delicately to her breast. "Perhaps we should not make a scene. Private papers are private." "Then perhaps no one should have dropped one in public," Beatrice said. The Duchess of Norbury watched with open fascination. Cecily's face had become very pale beneath its careful bloom. The Duke picked up the letter at last, holding it by the edge. His gaze moved over the exposed line. The change in him was almost invisible, but Beatrice felt it like a door closing against a storm. He folded the paper before others could read more. This is not Lady Beatrice's hand. Lady Maud gave a soft gasp. How can you know so quickly, Your Grace? Because I have seen her figures in a charity account. Her writing does not confuse vanity with grammar. A few people drew breath. Mr. Vale's smile thinned. Yet the contents may still matter. The Duke turned the letter slightly. Beatrice saw the red wax seal, broken by its fall. Its colour stirred memory. Lady Maud's notes at Halewig had been sealed with the same deep red, nearly brown at the edge, scented faintly with rose. The Duke saw her recognition. You know the wax? He asked quietly. Beatrice kept her voice calm. I have seen that shade before. Lady Maud's eye sharpened. Many ladies use red wax. Of course, Beatrice said. Some even use it carelessly. The crowd had grown dense around them, drawn by the promise of disgrace. The Duchess of Norbury's smile faded enough to show intelligence beneath appetite. Perhaps, she said, this should be discussed in my private parlour. No, the Duke said. Not tonight. Beatrice turned toward him. The answer struck her wrongly, though she understood the reason before he spoke again. A public accusation without full proof gives liars a better stage than truth. Lady Beatrice will not be made to defend herself in a lobby arranged by cowards. It was protection. It was also delay. And delay, to a woman standing under the eyes of London, could feel like abandonment dressed in strategy. Do you believe me? She asked before she could stop herself. The question was too low for the crowd, but not too low for him. For the first time that evening, the Duke's composure faltered. Only a fraction. Enough. I will prove it. The words should have comforted her. Instead, something inside her sank. Proving was not the same as believing. Or perhaps it was belief made suitable for public use, polished until it no longer felt warm. Beatrice inclined her head because anything else would have given the lobby more than it deserved. Then I shall wait for proof, Your Grace. She walked with him to the Wycliffe box because retreat would have pleased too many people. The opera began in a blaze of music, but Beatrice heard little of it. From the box, she could see fans tilt and heads turn in the tiers across the house. Cecily sat 2 rows behind the dowager, eyes fixed on the stage as if innocence required concentration. Lady Maud whispered once behind her glove. Mr. Vale appeared in a neighbouring box before the first act ended, looking pleased with a disaster not yet complete. The Duke stood at the back of the box, the folded letter inside his coat, his gaze travelling over the house rather than the stage. He was watching for the next move. Beatrice knew that. She wished it were enough. When the first interval began, she stepped into the corridor with the dowager. Cecily's voice reached her from beyond a screen of palms, soft as silk drawn over a blade. By tomorrow, even his protection will look like guilt. Beatrice stopped. The dowager's fan closed with a quiet snap. Somewhere behind them, the Duke heard it too. This time, when Beatrice turned, his face had gone utterly still. The music inside the theatre swelled again, but the true performance had moved into the shadows. By the time the Wycliffe party returned to Grosvenor Square, London had already begun improving the lie. It travelled faster than the carriages, slipping through supper rooms, private notes, servants' halls, and the amused mouths of gentlemen who had seen only a fallen letter and decided they understood the woman standing nearest to it. Lady Beatrice Vane sat opposite the Dowager Duchess in the town carriage, hands folded over the repaired pearl sash, while the opera music still rang somewhere behind her eyes and Cecily's whisper remained sharper than any note sung on stage. By tomorrow, even his protection will look like guilt. The Duke had heard it. She knew he had. He had gone so still in the corridor that the palms beside him might have seemed animated by comparison. Yet after that, he had said little. He had escorted her back to the box. He had stayed near enough for society to read his support, but not near enough to answer the question that had lodged beneath her ribs. Do you believe me? I will prove it. Proof was a noble word. It was also a cold one when a woman was standing in a room that wanted to make a spectacle of her shame. Wycliffe House received them with blazing lamps, swift footmen, and doors opened before anyone knocked. It was a grand London house, severe and magnificent, all marble steps and black railings and windows bright against the fog-softened square. Beatrice had visited houses like it often enough to know the difference between hospitality and shelter. This felt like neither. It felt like being placed inside a fortress whose master was not yet certain whether the best way to protect her was to stand beside her or lock the gates. In the hall, Lady Maud Carrow removed her gloves with trembling elegance. "What a distressing evening," she said, as if she had suffered the worst of it. A private family matter would have been painful enough, but in such a public place. The Duke handed his hat and gloves to a footman. It became public because someone dropped a forged letter in the lobby. Forged? Lady Maud's brows lifted. That is a strong conclusion. It is an accurate one. Cecily stood near the staircase, wrapped in white satin and wounded innocence. "Alastair, please. Must we keep speaking as though there are enemies in every corner?" Beatrice has had a shock. We all have. Beatrice turned toward her. The use of the Duke's Christian name was not quite improper among family friends, but it was intimate enough to be a claim. Cecily knew it. So did everyone present. The dowager's cane touched the marble once. "You will call my grandson by his title in this hall, Lady Cecily, unless he invites otherwise." Colour rose prettily in Cecily's cheeks. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I'm only anxious." Anxiety has never been a substitute for manners. The Duke looked not at Cecily, but at Beatrice. "Lady Beatrice, I would speak with you in the library. My grandmother will accompany us." It was properly done. Still, something in his voice warned her that this conversation would not be gentle. The library at Wycliffe House was long, dark, and lined with books that had clearly been collected by generations of men who expected their thoughts to be preserved. A fire burned low. The dowager took a chair near the hearth. Beatrice remained standing because the repaired sash felt suddenly too visible, too easily interpreted as either accusation or plea. The Duke placed the folded letter from the opera on the desk. Beside it he set the anonymous note Beatrice had given him after dinner the previous evening. He looked at both before speaking. "The letter in the lobby was meant to suggest that you engineered the torn gown to attract my notice. By morning, that version will reach at least 6 houses." "Only 6?" Beatrice asked. "London is losing its vigor." He did not smile. This is not a moment for courage as decoration. The words stung because they were not entirely unjust, and because she had thought he understood the difference. "What do you propose?" "You should leave London for a few days." Silence settled at once. Even the dowager's eye sharpened. Beatrice looked at him carefully. "Leave London." "Not in disgrace. In protection. Wycliffe has a smaller estate in Surrey. Quiet, respectable, properly staffed. My grandmother can arrange a suitable companion. You would be beyond the immediate reach of gossip while I trace the letter, the wax, the knife, and Vale's movements. And what will society call my absence? Temporary indisposition. How kind of them to make me ill after making me guilty." His jaw tightened. "Lady Beatrice, I am trying to prevent further harm. By removing me from view. By removing you from attack. Those are not always different things, Your Grace." The dowager said nothing, but Beatrice felt the older woman watching. The Duke drew a breath and turned slightly toward the fire, then back. "If you remain in London while the forged letter circulates, you will be followed by whispers at every call, every dinner, every shop door. If I accuse too soon, they will say I am blinded. If I say nothing, they will say I am ashamed. I need time." Beatrice heard the reason in every sentence. She hated that she heard it. "And while you take time, I disappear." "You are not disappearing. A woman sent away for her own good is rarely allowed to decide when she returns." His expression closed by degrees. "You think I would imprison you?" "No," she swallowed, because the truth was more painful than anger. "I think you would protect me so thoroughly that no one would need to hear my voice, including you." That reached him. She saw it. Then a knock came before he could answer, and a footman entered with visible reluctance. "Your Grace, Lady Cecily requests an audience with her Grace. She is much distressed." The dowager's mouth flattened. How punctual her distress has become. The Duke gave permission with a brief motion. Cecily entered moments later, pale, lovely, and carrying a handkerchief that had been used just enough to prove feeling without damaging her face. Lady Maud followed close behind. Cecily looked at the Dowager first, then at the Duke, then at Beatrice as if the sight of her caused pain. "I cannot bear this division," she whispered. "Your Grace, I know Beatrice has suffered embarrassment, but now everyone is speaking as though I am cruel. As though my whole family came to Halewick to injure her." Lady Maud placed a steadying hand on Cecily's shoulder. "The poor child has been weeping since we left the opera." Beatrice stood very still. It was a performance, but not an empty one. Cecily was frightened. Not of guilt. Of losing ground. "I never wished to divide anyone," Beatrice said. Cecily turned on her, sweetness cracking. "Then why does division follow you? At Halewick. At the opera. Now here." Wycliffe was expected to choose from ladies suited to his station, and suddenly every conversation is about you. There it was. Not the full truth, but close enough to cast a shadow. The Duke's voice went low. "Lady Cecily." Cecily flinched at the warning and made the flinch look delicate. Lady Maud stepped in at once. "Your Grace, forgive her. She is overset. We all are. A family connection has become a public scandal, and Lady Beatrice's presence under your roof tonight will not quiet it." Beatrice looked at Lady Maud. "No. I imagine it will give you a great deal to explain." The older woman smiled faintly. "My dear, I am not the one London is discussing." The Duke took the anonymous note from the desk. "Who knew of this?" Lady Maud blinked. "Of what?" "The note urging Lady Beatrice to leave before breakfast." Cecily's eyes widened. Too late. Beatrice saw it. So did the Duke. But instead of pressing Cecily, he turned to Beatrice with the same controlled, investigative voice he had used over the cut silk. "When exactly did you find it?" The question was reasonable. That was what made it hurt. "After returning to my chamber." "Did anyone besides Nell enter your room?" "No. Did you show it to anyone before dinner?" "No. Or why not?" Beatrice stared at him. The room seemed to narrow. She knew he was building a chain of evidence. She knew he needed sequence, witnesses, timing. Yet under Lady Maud's watchful eyes and Cecily's shining tears, his questions felt less like trust and more like examination. "Because I had just had my gown torn in front of a ballroom, Your Grace, and I had not yet arranged my humiliation into a tidy report." The Dowager's fan snapped shut. The Duke went still. Beatrice could feel the tremor in her own hands, so she folded them. "Do you believe me, or merely intend to prove me convenient to your conscience?" "That is not fair." His voice was quiet. "No," she said. "It is accurate." Cecily's tears spilled then, perfectly timed. Lady Maud murmured her name. The Duke looked as if he wanted to dismiss them all, to command the room into order and the truth into daylight by force of will alone. But truth, Beatrice had learned, did not arrive because powerful men wanted it quickly. Sometimes it required the person most wounded to refuse the safety of silence. Beatrice untied the repaired pearl sash with steady fingers. The small act drew every eye. She folded it once and placed it on the library desk beside the forged letter and the anonymous note. "You may keep your evidence, Your Grace. I will keep my name." His face changed. "Lady Beatrice. I will not go to Surrey. I will not be hidden at an estate until people decide whether I am victim, schemer, or inconvenience. My aunt Lady Miriam Vane has a house in Half Moon Street. She has written since my father's death that I may come whenever I need a door that opens without permission. I believe tonight qualifies." The Dowager rose. "You shall not leave alone." "No, Your Grace. I shall leave properly. With a maid, a footman, and a carriage in full view of your hall. Let them call that what they like." For the first time since she had met him, the Duke looked less cold than unguarded. "This is not what I wanted." "No," Beatrice said softly. "But it is what you chose when you mistook hiding me for standing beside me." She curtsied to the Dowager because the older woman had not betrayed her. She did not curtsy to Lady Maud. She did not look at Cecily. At the door, the Duke spoke her name again, stripped of title by accident or pain. Beatrice. She stopped, but did not turn fully. If you follow me now, they will say I left so you would chase me. If you let me go, they may learn I can walk without being carried. Behind her, no one answered. That was answer enough. 20 minutes later, Beatrice stepped from Wycliffe House beneath the bright lamps of Grosvenor Square, Nell at her side, a footman ahead, and the Dowager's own carriage waiting to take her to Lady Miriam's door. The repaired sash remained behind on the Duke's desk, lying between the forged letter and the warning note like a question he had not answered in time. Lady Miriam Vane opened the door of her Half-Moon Street house before the footman finished knocking, which told Beatrice that her aunt had been waiting behind Dignity rather than behind the parlour curtains. Lady Miriam was her father's elder sister, narrow as a walking cane and twice as difficult to bend, with silver hair drawn smoothly beneath a lace cap and eyes that could make a caller reconsider a lie before finishing it. She took in Beatrice's pale face, Nell's anxious posture, and the Dowager Duchess's carriage waiting in full view beneath the lamps. "Well," she said, "at least you have chosen a scandal with good horses." Beatrice laughed once, because the alternative was to tremble. "May I come in, Aunt?" "You may come in, take tea, and tell me which fool requires correction first." By morning, correction had become strategy. Lady Miriam did not ask whether Beatrice had been foolish to leave Wycliffe House. She asked what had been said, who had been present, where the forged letter had fallen, and whether the repaired sash remained with the Duke. She listened with the focused severity of a woman who had survived society by never mistaking politeness for safety. When Beatrice mentioned Madame Leroy's note, Lady Miriam rang for her bonnet before the tea had cooled. "Then we begin there." "This morning?" "No, my dear. We shall wait until gossip has eaten breakfast and written memoirs." "Of course this morning." They went properly, with Nell, a footman, and Lady Miriam's plain dark carriage, whose age made it uninteresting to most observers and therefore useful. Bond Street was already awake, bright with shop windows, modiste signs, and ladies pretending they had come only to look. Madame Leroy's establishment occupied a narrow front between a milliner and a jeweller, with cream curtains drawn just enough to suggest exclusivity without discouraging money. Inside, the air smelled of lavender, starch, and warmed silk. Madame Leroy herself came forward at once, a small Frenchwoman with black eyes and English caution. "Lady Beatrice." She curtsied, then looked at Lady Miriam and seemed to decide truth would be less dangerous than evasion. "I had hoped you would call." "So did we," Lady Miriam said. "It saves us the trouble of standing in your doorway until you remembered courage." Madame Leroy's mouth tightened. "Courage is expensive in my trade, my lady. Ladies forgive ugly sleeves sooner than they forgive honesty." Beatrice removed her glove slowly. "Who asked about my gown?" The modiste glanced toward the workroom curtain. "Not Lady Cecily herself. Her maid came with a sketch. She said Lady Cecily wished to surprise you with a repair before Hailwick, as a kindness." "A kindness that required knowing where the sash would fail," Beatrice said. "Yes." Madame Leroy lowered her voice. "My apprentice thought it strange. I was not present when the first inquiry was made." The girl answered more than she should have. "Is she here?" Beatrice asked. Madame hesitated. Lady Miriam's cane touched the floor. "Madam, if you dismiss the girl for telling the truth, I shall purchase every ribbon in your shop and tell every woman I dislike where I found them." The threat was absurd enough to be elegant. Madame Leroy disappeared behind the curtain and returned with a young apprentice whose red-rimmed eyes made her look barely older than 16. She curtsied so quickly she nearly dropped the measuring tape at her wrist. "I didn't know it was wicked, my lady," she said to Beatrice before anyone asked a question. "She said you were cousins." "She said Lady Cecily wanted the gown strengthened." "I thought it was kind." Beatrice's anger, which had been clean and sharp on the drive, changed shape. The girl had not meant harm. She had been used because she was useful and unprotected, which Beatrice understood better than she wished. "What is your name?" "Annie, my lady." "Then listen to me, Annie. I am not here to blame you for trusting a lady's maid who had no right to ask." The girl's eyes filled. "But I told her the sash clasped at the back. I told her the seam had been turned. I even showed her how strain would pull the silk if the thread was cut first. Lady Miriam went very still. Madame Leroy closed her eyes. Beatrice felt the room narrow around the words. Cut first. There it was. Not suspicion. Method. Was anything written? Beatrice asked. Annie nodded miserably. A rough sketch. Madame keeps scraps for accounts if there is payment. Madame Leroy crossed to a drawer beneath the cutting table and removed a thin ledger bound in green cloth. The payment was not entered as a gown alteration. It came as a consultation fee. I did not like the matter once I saw the sketch, so I kept the scrap. She laid a torn half-sheet on the table. A small drawing of a sash and back seam had been marked in pencil. Beside it were the initials CEV, and below them, in a neater hand, paid through Lady M. Carrow. Beatrice stared at the words until they steadied rather than shocked her. Lady Maud had not merely watched. She had arranged. Cecily had not merely tugged. She had prepared. "May I take this?" Beatrice asked. Madame Leroy looked frightened. "If it leaves my shop, my name leaves with it." "Your name may be protected," Lady Miriam said. "Your silence cannot be." Annie gave a small sob. Beatrice turned to her at once. "No one will say you planned this. But they'll send me away. Not for telling me the truth." Beatrice looked at Madame Leroy. "Will they?" The modiste pressed her lips together, then shook her head. "No. She stays. And she learns not to answer questions from maids who come with smiles instead of orders." Annie breathed as if someone had loosened a lacing around her ribs. Beatrice folded the sketch carefully. "Thank you." "My lady," Annie whispered, "there was one more thing." The maid had wax on her glove. Dark red. It marked the paper. Beatrice and Lady Miriam looked at each other. The forged letter. Lady Maud's seal. The chain tightened. When they stepped back onto Bond Street, the morning seemed brighter and more dangerous than before. Lady Miriam allowed Nell to settle in a carriage first, then paused as a tall figure approached from beside the jeweller's window. The Duke of Wycliffe removed his hat. He did not look like a man who had slept well. His face was controlled, but the control seemed earned at cost. Lady Miriam lifted both brows. "Your Grace." How remarkably unsurprising. He bowed to her first, then to Beatrice. "Lady Miriam." "Lady Beatrice." "I will not keep you if I am unwelcome." Beatrice felt the folded sketch inside her reticule. "That depends on whether you have come to ask more questions as though I am evidence." The word struck him. He accepted the blow without defense. "No. I came to apologize before I ask anything." Lady Miriam looked faintly approving despite herself. The Duke's gaze remained on Beatrice. "Last night I thought of danger as something outside you. Gossip. Letters. Men like Vale. Women like Lady Maud. I told myself that if I removed you from the field, I was preserving your name." He paused. The street noise moved around them, wheels and hooves and distant calls, but his voice held its own space. "I was wrong. I protected your name as though it were mine to manage. It was not." Beatrice had prepared herself for argument. She had not prepared herself for accountability spoken without ornament. "No," she said. "It was not. I should have answered you plainly at the opera." His hand tightened on the brim of his hat. "I believed you before the letter fell. I believed you before I saw the cut. I believed you when you stood in that ballroom and did not let cruelty write your face for you. I wanted proof because society listens badly to truth without paper. But I should not have made proof sound larger than trust." The folded sketch seemed to weigh more in Beatrice's reticule. "I found paper." His eye sharpened, but he did not step closer. "May I see it?" She held his gaze. "You may stand with me while I decide how it is used." "Yes." No hesitation. "And when this is brought before them, I speak." "Yes." "Not after you explain me. Not after the dowager softens the room." "I speak." "Yes," he said again. "I will stand where you can see me." The echo of what she had needed before she knew how to say it moved between them. Lady Miriam cleared her throat. Touching. Also exposed. Get in the carriage before half of Bond Street writes a sonnet about repentance. Beatrice turned toward the carriage, but a prickle moved along the back of her neck. Across the street, near a bookseller's awning, Mr. Edmund Vale stood with one hand on his cane and his eyes fixed on Madame Leroy's door. The moment he saw that Beatrice had seen him, he smiled. Not broadly. Not kindly. Then he stepped back toward a plain dark carriage with no crest on the panel. By the time Beatrice was seated, it had begun to move. Their own carriage rolled westward through Mayfair, Lady Miriam silent beside her, Nell stiff with worry, the Duke's groom falling in at a distance behind them. At the corner, Beatrice glanced through the rear window. The unmarked carriage had turned as well. It followed without haste, like a rumor certain it would arrive before the truth. The unmarked carriage followed for nearly half a mile before Lady Miriam Vane lowered the small curtain with 2 fingers and said, "A man who trails a lady so clumsily is either desperate or accustomed to frightening people who cannot answer back." Beatrice kept one hand inside her reticule, folded around the sketch from Madame Leroy's workroom. The paper had edges sharp enough to feel like a blade through kid leather. Outside, Mayfair passed in pale facades, iron railings, and the restrained motion of a morning that seemed far too civilized for pursuit. Nell sat opposite with her knees pressed together and her eyes fixed on Beatrice's face, waiting to be told whether she should be afraid. Beatrice would not give fear a larger seat than it had already taken. "Do we continue to Half Moon Street?" Nell whispered. "Yes," Beatrice said. "We do not change course because a coward has hired plain wheels." Lady Miriam gave a small approving hum. Your father would have enjoyed that sentence. The carriage turned from Bond Street toward a quieter side street, where delivery carts slowed the way and a brewer's wagon stood half across the lane. Their coachman drew up with a muttered apology. The unmarked carriage stopped behind them. Beatrice saw the door open in the window's reflection before Mr. Edmund Vale appeared beside their carriage, hat in hand, expression arranged into concern. He did not look like a villain. That was part of the danger. He looked like a gentleman who had misplaced his better nature and expected society to return it after dinner. "Lady Beatrice," he said, bowing. "What good fortune?" Lady Miriam tapped her cane once against the carriage floor. Fortune has become a lazy word for men waiting in side streets. Vale's smile held. "Lady Miriam, I would never presume to delay you without reason." "Then don't." His gaze moved to Beatrice. "I only hope to spare your niece further embarrassment." Beatrice leaned back slightly, allowing the open window to remain between them. "How generous. You seem surrounded by opportunities to spare me embarrassment after arranging it." His eyes cooled. "You should be careful with accusations. And you should be careful with timing. Yours is beginning to look rehearsed." He glanced once at the driver, once at Nell, once at the footman seated behind. He wanted privacy. He would not have it. "You have been calling on a modiste this morning," he said softly. "A harmless errand, perhaps. Or perhaps not. Ladies' shops have back rooms. Back rooms have gossip. If anyone were to say you met someone there to invent a story against your cousin, the town would not find it difficult to believe after last night's letter." Nell's face went white. Lady Miriam's cane stopped moving. Beatrice felt the threat settle exactly where he intended it to settle, around reputation, movement, and the narrow space society allowed a woman to defend herself without being accused of noise. She opened her reticule, not enough for him to see inside, only enough to feel the folded sketch again. "Mr. Vale, you have followed my carriage to tell me what London might say. I have followed your carriage to advise you that London says what it is fed. Then perhaps you should improve its diet." His smile slipped. "Return to your aunt's house. Leave the Duke to his dignity. Let Lady Cecily's name remain undisturbed, and the unpleasantness may fade." "Unpleasantness," Beatrice repeated. "Is that what you call planned humiliation?" "I call it a small accident that has become dangerously inflated by your pride." Lady Miriam made a sound of disgust. "Small accidents do not hire gentlemen with debts." Vale's eyes flashed toward her. "There." Beatrice saw it. A nerve touched. "My finances are not your concern, madam." Men always say that when their finances have become everyone else's risk. Beatrice lifted her chin. Coachman, when the wagon clears, you will drive directly to Lady Miriam's house. Not to Wycliffe House. Not around the square. Directly home. Vale leaned closer to the window. Home may not remain safe if you continue. The footman shifted above them, but Beatrice raised a hand to stop him. She would not let this become a scene he could retell as hysteria. Are you threatening me, Mr. Vale? I am warning you. Then make the warning useful. Who paid you? His face closed. You imagine yourself much cleverer than you are. No. I imagine you much more frightened than you wish to appear. For a moment, the elegant mask thinned. He looked toward the street behind them. Beatrice followed the glance. A Wycliffe groom sat mounted at the corner, still as a post, his gaze fixed on the carriage. He had been following since Bond Street. Behind him, another rider approached through the slow traffic, dark coat, dark hat, unmistakable bearing. The Duke of Wycliffe did not hurry. He never seemed to hurry. Yet the space around him made haste unnecessary. Vale saw him and swore under his breath, too softly for Nell, but not for Beatrice. Then he spoke quickly, anger sharpening his Polish. You should have left after the ballroom. The sash was only meant to tear, not make him choose her. Silence struck the carriage. Vale heard himself too late. His mouth shut. Beatrice did not move. Lady Miriam did not breathe loudly. Nell's hand rose to her lips. The Duke reined in beside the carriage before Vale could retreat. 2 passers-by had paused near the baker's door. The brewer's boy looked openly interested. A footman from a nearby house stood on the steps with a parcel in his hands. Witnesses. Not enough for law. Enough for society. The Duke looked down at Vale. Repeat that. Vale bowed with a brittle laugh. Your Grace, I was offering Lady Beatrice reassurance. You were offering a threat. A misunderstanding. You have an unusual talent for being misunderstood near forged letters, missing knives, and ladies' carriages. Vale's color changed. Careful, Wycliffe. The Duke's voice lowered. You will address me properly, or you will not address me at all. The correction was quiet. Its effect was immediate. Vale bowed again, deeper this time. Your Grace. Beatrice opened the carriage door before any gentleman could do it for her. She did not step down. She remained framed in the doorway, elevated enough to be heard and proper enough to be safe. Mr. Vale was warning me that London says what it is fed. The Duke's gaze moved to her, and in it she saw the apology from Bond Street become action. He did not tell her to be silent. He did not ask whether she was distressed. He waited. Beatrice continued. He also said the sash was only meant to tear, not make you choose her. The witnesses heard enough. The baker's wife appeared behind the glass. The brewer's boy stared. Vale's jaw tightened. A lady under strain may mishear. Then you will have no objection to repeating your meaning before my grandmother, Lady Miriam, Madame Leroy, and any other person whose memory has not been purchased, the Duke said. Vale's gaze darted toward the unmarked carriage. I have an appointment. Cancel it. You cannot detain me in the street. I have no wish to detain you. I prefer invitations. They reveal who fears attendance. The Duke turned to his groom. Mr. Hargreaves, you heard Mr. Vale's statement. The groom touched his hat. I did, Your Grace. The footman. Beatrice's footman leaned forward. Yes, Your Grace. Lady Miriam said, I heard it, and at my age I no longer waste hearing on nonsense. The Duke looked back at Vale. You will receive a formal notice within the hour. So will Lady Maud Carrow. So will Lady Cecily Vane. There will be a drawing-room inquiry at Wycliffe House tomorrow morning. Vale's laugh came out thin. A drawing-room inquiry? How very grand. No. Grand would be unnecessary. This will be exact. Beatrice felt the street, the carriage, the witnesses, and the folded sketch all gather into one line of consequence. Vale had tried to make movement dangerous. Instead, he He had spoken where others could hear. The Duke dismounted, but he did not approach Beatrice until she gave the smallest nod. Even then, he stood a proper distance from the carriage door. "Lady Beatrice, do you wish to proceed to Lady Miriam's house?" The question was deliberate. He asked before witnesses. He made choice visible. Beatrice understood what he was giving back. "Yes, Your Grace." "Then you shall." "And after that?" "After that, only if you agree, my grandmother and I will call upon you with the evidence already gathered. Nothing will be done in your name without your consent." Vale's face darkened because the words denied every version of the tale he wished to sell. Beatrice looked from him to the Duke. "Now we do not hide." The Duke's eyes held hers. "No, now we invite them all." "Yes," he said. "And this time, they will not choose the room." The wagon cleared at last. Lady Miriam drew Beatrice gently back inside and closed the door. As the carriage rolled forward, Beatrice looked once through the window. Vale stood in the street with his hat in his hand, no longer smiling. The Duke remained mounted until Lady Miriam's carriage turned the corner, his groom behind, the witnesses already carrying the scene into London by glance and whisper. By noon, formal notices left Wycliffe House under black and silver seal, delivered to Lady Maud Carrow, Lady Cecily Vane, Mr. Edmund Vale, Madame Leroy, Mrs. Pelham, and the apprentice Annie. By dusk, London knew that Wycliffe had asked questions. By nightfall, the people who had laughed in the ballroom understood that the torn silk had become more dangerous mended than it had ever been whole. By evening, Half Moon Street had become quieter than any battlefield Beatrice could imagine, not because there was peace within it, but because everyone inside understood that tomorrow would decide who had the right to tell the story. Lady Miriam's drawing room smelled of lamp oil, tea, and old books, a narrow room with faded green curtains and furniture that had survived 3 changes in fashion by refusing to apologize. Beatrice stood at the writing table with the evidence arranged before her in careful order. The sketch from Madame Leroy. The note urging her to leave before breakfast. A copy of the forged letter from the opera brought by Wycliffe's steward. A sealed packet containing the pearl thread from the missing ribbon knife. The repaired sash itself had been returned that afternoon by a Wycliffe footman, folded in clean linen, not as property reclaimed by the Duke but as something placed back into the hands to which it belonged. Beatrice had not opened it at once. She had set it beside the other papers and waited until her breathing became steady. Lady Miriam watched from near the fire, spectacles low on her nose. "You have placed the sash in the center. That is where they placed my humiliation. And where will you place yourself?" Beatrice looked at the table. Not behind anyone. A knock came before Lady Miriam could answer. The maid announced the Dowager Duchess of Wycliffe and the Duke himself. They entered together, properly, formally, with all the old rules honored so no one could use impropriety to distract from truth. The Dowager wore black silk tonight, severe and unadorned except for a single diamond pin. The Duke looked as he had in the street that morning, controlled, unsmiling, and not entirely untouched. He bowed first to Lady Miriam, then to Beatrice. "Lady Beatrice." "Your Grace." The formality hung between them, necessary and not enough. The Dowager took the chair Lady Miriam indicated and looked at the evidence with the sharp satisfaction of a woman who preferred clean lines in war. "Madame Leroy has agreed to attend tomorrow with the apprentice. Mrs. Pelham will come from Halewick. My steward has Vale's debt note and confirmation that Lady Maud settled one portion of it 2 days before the house party." Lady Miriam gave a grim little smile. "How charitable of her." "Lady Maud has always been charitable where she expects profit," the Dowager said. The Duke remained standing. "I have also recovered the envelope used for the forged letter. The wax is not proof by itself, but its color and scent match Lady Maud's correspondence. The hand is disguised, but the phrase about a lady turning distress into advantage appears in one of her notes to my grandmother last year." Beatrice lifted her eyes. "So she has said it before. Often enough to forget it is distinctive." "Cruel people repeat themselves," Lady Miriam said. "They think variation is for the innocent." The Dowager's gaze moved to Beatrice. "Tomorrow, the room will resist you. Lady Maud will soften every word until accusation sounds vulgar. Cecily will weep. Vale will pretend not to remember what he said. The matrons will wish for comfort over truth because comfort asks nothing of them. Then I must make truth uncomfortable enough to be noticed. Yes, the dowager said. But you must not have to do it alone. The Duke finally spoke. I can present the evidence. Beatrice turned toward him slowly. The words were offered with care. That was what made them dangerous. Can you? Yes. I know how to order a room. I know. I know how to prevent interruption. I know that as well. He looked at the sash on the table, then back at her. I know how to make them listen. To you. Silence fell. Lady Miriam lowered her spectacles. The dowager's face gave nothing away, but her fan stilled in her lap. The Duke absorbed the correction as if it had weight. I do not mean to take this from you. No, Beatrice said. You mean to spare me the cost of it. But if you speak all of it, they will say I survived because the Duke of Wycliffe lent me a voice. They will say I was believed because you chose to believe me. They will say the room bowed to rank, not to truth. His jaw tightened. Rank is useful. So is a locked door. That doesn't mean one should live behind it. Lady Miriam's mouth moved as if she approved and knew better than to say so. Beatrice placed her hand on the folded linen. In the ballroom, they saw my gown tear. In the opera lobby, they saw a letter fall at my feet. In the street, they saw Mr. Vale speak before he thought. Tomorrow, they must see me put the pieces together. Not after you explain me. Not after you rescue me with better diction. Me. The Duke's eyes held hers. For once, there was nothing cold in them. Only restraint with pain beneath it. I wanted to be your shield. Then stand where I can see you, not where I disappear behind you. The sentence changed the room. It did not sound dramatic when she said it. It sounded like something she had learned by losing too much space to other people's good intentions. The Duke looked down. When he lifted his gaze again, something in him had yielded without collapsing. Tomorrow, you speak first. You decide what is shown and when. I will keep order only if they try to silence you. Beatrice felt the breath she had been holding leave quietly. And if I falter? Then I will not mistake faltering for permission to take your place. I will ask whether you wish to continue. The dowager nodded once. At last. Sense has joined us. The faintest shadow of humor touched the Duke's mouth and vanished. He reached into his coat and removed a small leather folder. These are copies. The originals remain sealed with my steward until morning. I brought them so you may arrange your own order. He placed the folder on the table and stepped back at once, as if the distance mattered. It did. Beatrice opened the folder. The documents were neat, labeled, and complete. No flourish. No performance. Just evidence put within her reach. The act steadied her more than another apology would have done. The dowager looked toward the fire, and her voice changed. Lady Beatrice, I owe you an apology as well. Beatrice looked up quickly. Your Grace? Halewick was my arrangement. I disguised family pressure as hospitality and called it discretion. I believed I was protecting my grandson from fortune hunters, sentimental mothers, and political marriages arranged by people who see a duchy as a locked chest. In doing so, I permitted a room full of women to be weighed like silver. The old woman's fingers tightened around her fan. You paid for that vanity in torn silk. Beatrice did not know what to do with an apology from someone powerful enough never to offer one. You did not tear it. No. But I built the room where it could happen. The honesty was plain and hard. Beatrice found herself respecting it because it asked for no comfort. Then tomorrow we unbuild it. The dowager's eyes gleamed. Precisely. For the next hour, they worked. Lady Miriam sharpened wording until no phrase could be dismissed as hysteria. The dowager predicted which matron would object and which would pretend not to understand. The Duke answered only when asked, and when he did, he gave facts, not commands. Beatrice placed the sash first, then the cut thread, then the modiste sketch, then the payment scrap, then the wax, then Vale Street admission. Order mattered. A story could be twisted. A sequence was harder to strangle. Near 10 o'clock, the dowager rose, signalling the end of propriety's allowance. Lady Miriam called for the carriage. The Duke remained by the door while his grandmother moved ahead with Lady Miriam, leaving them visible from the hall but briefly outside conversation. "Lady Beatrice," he said. "Yes?" He seemed to choose each word as though any careless one might bruise what had only begun to mend. "Tomorrow will give you justice, I hope. It may also give you attention you never asked for. I know. When it is done, I would ask permission to call upon you. Not as a strategist. Not as a witness." Her hand tightened over the leather folder. "As what?" The answer rose in his eyes before he allowed it near his mouth. He stopped it there, and that restraint moved her more than declaration would have done. "As a man who has more to answer for than the conduct of his guests." Beatrice looked at him, at the stern mouth, the tired eyes, the dignity that had finally learned to bow without making a spectacle of humility. "Ask me after tomorrow." "I will." He bowed, not deeply, but with a gravity that felt like promise. When the door closed behind him, Beatrice returned to the table and opened the linen at last. The pearl sash lay within, mended in her own uneven silver-grey thread, still scarred, still hers. She folded it over her arm. In the morning, she would carry it into Wycliffe House not as shame, not as ornament, but as the first witness called. The next morning, Wycliffe House did not resemble a home so much as a roomed argument waiting to be spoken. The drawing-room had been arranged with deliberate restraint. No music. No flowers beyond a single bowl of white camellias on the mantel. No attempt to soften what would happen there. The Dowager Duchess sat near the hearth in black silk, Lady Miriam Vane at her right, and the Duke of Wycliffe stood by the window with his hands behind his back, not commanding the room so much as preventing it from lying to itself. Beatrice entered last by choice. She wore a plain dove-grey gown borrowed from her aunt, with no ornament at her throat and no pearl sash at her waist. The sash lay folded over her arm, mended in silver-grey thread, visible to every eye. Lady Maud Carrow sat near the sofa with her chin lifted and her gloves arranged as if elegance could serve as a legal defence. Cecily sat beside her, pale and lovely, holding a handkerchief with both hands. Mr. Edmund Vale stood near the door, his expression polished thin. Madame Leroy waited with Annie, the apprentice, who looked terrified but determined. Mrs. Pelham stood behind the dowager's chair. Several matrons who had witnessed the ballroom scene had been invited, and they had come with the solemn curiosity of people who wish to see justice, provided justice did not ask too much of them. As Beatrice crossed the carpet, no one spoke. That was the first reversal. In the ballroom, silence had been a weapon. Here, it became space. She placed the torn sash on the central table. "This was the first thing made public," she said. Her voice was calm enough that she trusted it. "So it will be the first thing answered." Lady Maud gave a soft sigh. "My dear Lady Beatrice, I'm sure no one wishes to prolong your embarrassment." Beatrice looked at her. "Then you should not have arranged it." The room stilled. Cecily's handkerchief twisted between her fingers. Lady Maud's eyes cooled. "That's a grave accusation." "Yes," Beatrice said. "It is." She unfolded the sash. "At Halewick Park, Lady Cecily said she barely touched me. The tear was called an accident. His Grace examined the fabric and saw what I had not seen. The silk had been cut before it was pulled." The Duke moved only far enough to place the sealed envelope beside the sash. "The thread found on the missing ribbon knife matches the pearl thread from Lady Beatrice's sash," he said. "Mrs. Pelham can confirm where the knife was found." Mrs. Pelham curtsied. "In the coal scuttle near the service passage behind the ballroom, Your Grace." It had not been there before the presentation. Lady Maud lifted a hand. "A servant's memory under pressure is not proof." "No," Beatrice said. "That is why there is more." She placed Madame Leroy's sketch on the table. The pencil line showed the back of the ivory gown, the clasp, the strained seam. Before Halewick, someone asked how my gown fastened and where it would fail if the thread were cut. Madame Leroy stepped forward. "My apprentice answered the inquiry, my lady. She believed it was made for a repair." Annie's voice trembled, but she did not retreat. Lady Cecily's maid brought the sketch. She said Lady Cecily wanted to help Lady Beatrice. She asked where the sash would pull if someone needed to strengthen it. Cecily let out a small, wounded sound. Annie, you must be mistaken. My maid runs errands for many people. Not with your initials on the payment scrap, Beatrice said. She laid down the half-sheet from the ledger. C.V. paid through Lady M. Carrow. One of the matrons drew in a breath. Lady Maud's face hardened. Modistes make errors. Apprentices gossip. A scrap of paper is not a confession. Then let us consider the letter at the opera. Beatrice placed the copy of the forged letter beside the sketch. A letter fell at my feet in front of half of London. It suggested I had torn my own gown to attract the Duke's attention. The wax on the envelope matches the wax used in your correspondence, Lady Maud, including the rose scent. Lady Maud gave a small, pitying smile. Red wax is common. Phrases are less common, the Duke said. He placed another paper on the table. The forged letter uses the phrase, turning distress into advantage. You used the same phrase in a note to my grandmother last year concerning another young woman whose reputation you wish to manage. The dowager's voice was dry and cutting. I kept the note. I have always disliked waste. Mr. Vale laughed under his breath. This is all very pretty, but no one has shown who wrote anything. Lady Miriam turned her sharp eyes on him. How eager you are to reach the part where your memory fails. Beatrice looked at Vale. Yesterday, in the street, you said, the sash was only meant to tear, not make him choose her. Vale's smile stiffened. I said no such thing. You did, the Duke said. My groom heard it. Lady Miriam heard it. Lady Beatrice's footman heard it. So did two tradesmen who have already confirmed the words to my steward. Vale's face changed then. Not completely. Enough. Lady Maud rose. This is absurd. A gentleman's careless phrase in the street has been twisted into persecution. Lady Beatrice suffered an unfortunate accident and has allowed attention to flatter her into suspicion. The old cruelty returned to the room, dressed in composure. Beatrice felt it reach for her. Poor relation. Hysterical. Convenient. She put one hand on the torn sash and did not let it. No, she said. I was poor enough to be made a lesson. I was related closely enough to be used without appearing cruel. I was quiet enough that you believed I would leave when threatened. But I was not invisible enough for the Duke to miss your hand, and I was not grateful enough to call humiliation an accident. Cecily's tears finally fell, not prettily now, but with anger beneath them. You were never supposed to be seen, she said. You were there because father insisted the family look generous. You were meant to stand behind me. You were meant to remind everyone what happens to a lady without money. The confession was not clean, but it was enough. Lady Maud closed her eyes for 1 second. The matron sat frozen. The dowager rose slowly. Lady Cecily Vane, you will leave London today under your father's authority. You will not be received at Halewick Park again. Lady Maud, Wycliffe patronage is withdrawn from every committee, subscription, and social effort bearing your influence. I will inform the appropriate hostesses that this house no longer recognizes your judgment. Lady Maud went white. Your Grace, you cannot mean to ruin years of work over a torn sash. The Duke spoke then, and the room obeyed him before he finished the first word. No. Over deliberate cruelty, a forged letter, intimidation, and an attempt to sacrifice a woman's name for ambition. He turned to Vale. Your notes of debt will be called in through proper channels. You will not enter any house under Wycliffe protection again. Vale swallowed. For once, he had no elegant answer. Cecily looked at the Duke with sudden desperation. Your Grace, I didn't mean for it to go so far. You meant for it to go far enough. His voice was cold, but not loud. You misjudged the distance. The room held its breath. Beatrice realized then that the justice she had feared might feel like spectacle did not. It felt quieter. Heavier. It felt like a door closing on a lie that had been allowed too many rooms. The dowager crossed to Beatrice and stopped before her. Lady Beatrice Vane leaves this room with more dignity than many entered it with. The words moved through the listeners like a verdict no one dared soften. Beatrice inclined her head, not because she was humbled, but because she accepted what had been returned to her. The matrons rose one by one. Some curtsied to the dowager. 2 curtsied to Beatrice. Lady Maud did not look at her as she left. Cecily tried to, then failed. Vale departed last, escorted not by force, but by the knowledge that no door in that circle would easily open to him again. When the drawing-room emptied, the silence changed. It no longer pressed on Beatrice. It made room for her to breathe. The Duke took the folded sash from the table and held it out with both hands. "It belongs with you." She accepted it. It always did. He looked at her as if the words had struck somewhere beneath rank, beneath strategy, beneath every cold habit that had once kept him safe. "Lady Beatrice, may I call tomorrow?" A faint ache passed through her, tender because it was asked, not claimed. As a witness. No, his voice was quiet. As a man who should have stood beside you sooner. She looked down at the mended silk, the visible seam, the pearls that had not all survived but had not all been lost. "Then yes, Your Grace. You may call." The next morning, the Duke of Wycliffe called at Half Moon Street with a card, a chaperone, and no presumption. Beatrice received him in Lady Miriam's drawing-room while her aunt sat by the fire with a book open on her lap and the expression of a woman who intended to read none of it. The Duke did not bring flowers. He brought the names of every hostess who had already withdrawn invitations from Lady Maud Carrow, confirmation that Cecily had been taken to her father's country estate before dawn, and a note from the Dowager Duchess asking whether Lady Beatrice would consider returning to Halewick Park when she wished, not before. It was not a romantic beginning. That was why Beatrice trusted it. For several weeks, he came properly, never too often, never alone, never with the impatience of a man accustomed to having forgiveness delivered with tea. Sometimes they spoke of the scandal because silence would have made it larger. Sometimes they spoke of the widow's coal fund, and Beatrice discovered that Wycliffe understood accounts the way other men understood horses, with stern affection and no tolerance for decorative errors. Once, when Lady Miriam fell asleep openly in her chair and pretended she had not, the Duke said, "I have spent years believing control was the same as protection." Beatrice looked at him across the small table. "It is easier to control a room than to trust the person standing in it." "Yes." He lowered his gaze to his gloves. "And I was very proud of being good at the easier thing." That confession did more than any polished compliment could have done. It made space for something honest to grow, slowly and without spectacle. When the invitation finally came for Beatrice to visit Halewick Park again, she nearly refused. Her fingers rested on the envelope for an entire minute before she broke the seal. Lady Miriam watched her from the breakfast table. "If you do not wish to go, you needn't prove bravery by revisiting a flaw." Beatrice smiled faintly. "You used a contraction outside dialogue, aunt. At my age, grammar may come to me for permission." Beatrice looked down at the dowager's clear, firm hand. "Not a summons. Not a strategy. An invitation. I do not want that room to remain larger in memory than it is in stone." So she went. The journey to Hampshire felt different the second time. The road was the same, the hedgerows newly green, the wheels turning over miles that had once carried her toward humiliation. Yet the carriage was Lady Miriam's, not the Avelmere family's. Nell sat beside her with a new bonnet ribbon Beatrice had insisted she buy. The torn pearl sash lay wrapped in linen inside Beatrice's travelling case, no longer hidden in shame but not worn for display. Halewick Park appeared beyond the trees in late afternoon light, pale and watchful as before. This time, Beatrice did not feel measured by it. She felt received. Mrs. Pelham met her on the steps and curtsied with a warmth that manners could not quite conceal. The Dowager Duchess waited in the hall. "Lady Beatrice," she said. "Welcome back." Beatrice curtsied. "Your Grace." The older woman's gaze softened by a degree that would have been invisible to anyone who had not learned her face. "The ballroom is open if you wish to avoid it. Or closed if you wish to forget it. Or neither if you wish to decide later." Beatrice drew a breath. "I would like to see it now." No one questioned her. The dowager led the way only to the doors, then stopped. Lady Miriam remained beside her. Nell waited with Mrs. Pelham in the passage. The Duke stood inside the ballroom, beneath the gallery, not at the centre, not in command, simply present. The afternoon sun lay across the polished floor where pearls had once scattered. The chairs were gone. The cruel audience was gone. Without them, the room looked almost innocent, which offended Beatrice until she understood that rooms did not create cruelty by themselves. People furnished them with it. She stepped inside. The floor did not remember her. That helped. The Duke watched her carefully. Should I have had it changed? No, she looked toward the gallery. It should remain what it was. Otherwise, I might wonder whether I survived only because the evidence was redecorated. He came closer, stopping several feet away. I have ended the arrangement my grandmother began. There will be no more gatherings designed to make women compete beneath the name of hospitality. That is wise. It is late. Wisdom often is. His mouth moved with the smallest trace of rueful humor. You are generous to call it wisdom. Beatrice turned slowly in the room. She could almost see the ghost of herself standing there in ivory silk, cheeks hot, spine straight, the world narrowing to the sound of fabric tearing. She wanted to comfort that woman. She wanted to tell her that the humiliation would not be the end of her name. Instead, she opened the linen parcel she had carried in her hands and unfolded the pearl sash. The repair was visible, though not as she had left it. Someone had strengthened her uneven grey stitches with fine silver thread, so delicate that the seam looked neither concealed nor embellished. It looked honored. Beatrice looked up sharply. The Duke's eyes remained on the sash. I asked Mrs. Pellen who at Halewick had the finest needlework. She said no one should touch it without your permission. She was right. So I sent only a request to a silver embroiderer in London and asked how one might preserve a damaged seam without pretending it had never torn. The work was done on a separate backing. It can be removed if you dislike it. Beatrice touched the silver thread. You did not try to make it look new. No, or why? His answer came quietly. Because I do not love what was untouched. I love what remained. The ballroom seemed to fall away, not in spectacle, but in stillness. Beatrice kept her eyes on the sash because his face would have undone her too quickly. Your Grace. Alastair, he said, then stopped himself. Forgive me. Only if you wish it. She looked at him then. Alastair. His breath changed. One small sound, almost nothing. Enough. He reached inside his coat and removed no grand jewel, no theatrical token, only a small folded paper. This is not a proposal. That surprised her into a laugh. An unusual beginning. It is a settlement draft. If I ever ask for your hand, you will first know exactly what independence remains yours. Your aunt may read it. Your solicitor may tear it to pieces if he finds fault. You will retain control over your personal inheritance, however modest. You will continue the charity accounts if you choose. Lady Miriam may live wherever she pleases, including near Halewick, if she wishes to terrorize Hampshire. From the doorway, Lady Miriam said, I heard that. I intended you to, he replied. Beatrice held the paper, understanding the gift beneath the legal form. He was not asking her to step into safety as a dependent. He was giving her the ground beneath any answer. And after I read it. He looked at the gallery above them, then back at her. Then I will ask whether the man who saw you wronged and failed once to trust you well enough may spend his life learning to stand beside you properly. Her throat tightened. That sounds very much like a proposal trying to behave itself. It is struggling. She laughed softly, and the sound did not break. It healed. Then let it stop struggling. He went still. Beatrice folded the settlement draft once and held it against the sash. Ask me. He did not kneel, not on a ballroom floor that had once been used to reduce her. He stood before her as an equal in dignity, though never in rank, and his voice was low enough that only those who loved her could hear. Lady Beatrice Vane, will you become Duchess of Wycliffe, not because this house chose you, not because society corrected itself, and not because I protected you too late, but because you wish to build a life where your voice is never treated as an ornament? Beatrice looked at the silver seam, then at the man who had finally understood that love was not rescue if it left no room for choice. Yes, she said. I will. The announcement was made that evening in the family drawing room, with a dowager, Lady Miriam, Mrs. Pelham standing discreetly near the door, and Nell crying openly into a handkerchief she claimed was dusty. There was no ballroom applause. No crowd hungry for reversal. Only the dowager lifting her glass and saying, to the future Duchess of Wycliffe, who has already improved the title by refusing to be impressed by it. Months later, after the wedding, Beatrice placed the pearl sash in a small glass-fronted cabinet in her private sitting room at Halewick. Beside it lay her first calling card as Beatrice Harcourt, Duchess of Wycliffe. The scene showed. The silver held. And whenever afternoon light touched the pearls, she did not see the moment the silk had torn. She saw the moment she had remained.